There's a legend whispered around campfires from Laramie to Santa Fe, a tale so extraordinary most dismiss it as frontier fantasy until they meet someone who was there. I've recounted it more times than the notches on a veteran gunslinger's belt, tried to do justice to what unfolded that blood-soaked autumn of 1883, but words always fall short of capturing its raw truth. Still, this story demands telling, a tale of calculated vengeance, quiet honor, and how a single man who'd renounced violence became the storm that swept an empire of cruelty from the face of the earth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cottonwood Springs barely warranted a spot on any decent map. Just another dusty crossroads carved from the unforgiving New Mexico territory where hope withered faster than corn in August drought. They used to call it God's afterthought. A single rutted street bordered by sun-bleached buildings, a church whose last preacher fled after receiving death threats, and the Broken Spur saloon that did more business in a day than all other establishments combined in a week. But beneath that parched, worthless soil lay something men would torture, maim, and kill for: gold, pure and abundant. A vein so rich it could transform a common drifter into a man of means or into a corpse cooling in the desert sun, depending on who learned of his find first. Most locals can still recall how things were before the Scorpion Gang claimed Cottonwood Springs as their private kingdom. The settlement wasn't prosperous by any measure, but it was peaceful. Ranchers tended their herds, shopkeepers earned modest livings, and folks generally kept to themselves without fear of predation. That tranquility shattered the day Ezekiel, Scorpion Maddox and his band of cutthroats rode in, trailing the scent of gunpowder and bringing an atmosphere as poisonous as their namesake. They moved systematically, with a cunning that belied their brutality. Judge William Haynes, may whatever's left of his corrupted soul find no peace, facilitated their takeover, helping them seize properties through fraudulent liens and rigged tax auctions. Those who protested this theft of their livelihoods quickly discovered the lethal consequences of resistance. The Andersons were the first to learn this brutal lesson. Their small ranch burned one night, flames climbing skyward like the vengeful spirits of those who'd suffered before them. By dawn, nothing remained but smoldering timber and a chilling message for anyone contemplating defiance: the Winslow family. Soon followed, then the Richardsons. Each time Sheriff Clay Bennett would investigate with theatrical thoroughness before declaring yet another unfortunate accident. Everyone recognized the deception, but knowing the truth and having the power to challenge it are separate matters entirely. That was the state of affairs when he rode into town. Few spared more than a passing glance for the weathered man astride. The copper-colored Morgan horse with a distinctive white blaze, another drifter seeking shelter from life's storms in a town too preoccupied with its own troubles to inquire about his. He secured lodging in the abandoned Simmons cabin north of town, a plot of seemingly worthless scrubland overlooking the settlement that most considered too exposed to the elements for comfortable habitation. Thomas Blackwood, he called himself, though some would later insist that name was merely another layer of the elaborate disguise he'd constructed. I remember the exact moment he first caught my attention, standing at my general store counter, purchasing supplies with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a man accustomed to providing for himself. "New in town?" I asked, wrapping his purchases in brown paper. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice carrying the gritty texture of a man who'd spent years saying only what was necessary. "Looking for someplace quiet to settle for a spell." I must have failed to hide my bitter amusement, because his eyes, grey as gunmetal and twice as cold, fixed on mine with unnerving intensity. "Something funny about that notion, Mr. Sullivan. Morgan Sullivan, I replied, feeling strangely compelled toward honesty beneath that piercing gaze. And no, not funny. Tragic, perhaps. Cottonwood Springs hasn't known quiet for quite some time. Blackwood nodded almost imperceptibly, as if I'd merely confirmed something he'd already deduced. Trouble has a way of finding places like this, remote, unprotected. It's found us, sure enough, I agreed, lowering my voice despite the empty store, wears a scorpion emblem and carries a judge's blessing. Something flickered across his face then, too quick to identify, but potent enough to send a chill down my spine. He paid for his goods with coins that gleamed suspiciously bright for a man in trail-worn clothes, thanked me with formal courtesy, and departed without another word. I recall watching him through the window as he secured his packages to his saddle. There was something in his movements, a fluid economy, a practiced precision that seemed at odds with his appearance as a simple homesteader. The contradiction nagged at me, like a splinter beneath the skin too deep to extract. The following morning dawned blisteringly hot, the kind of day where the very air seems to suck moisture from your lungs. I was arranging a new shipment of canned goods when Sheriff Bennett burst through my door, hat pushed back and hand hovering near his holstered Remington. "That stranger who bought supplies yesterday. What did he tell you about himself?" he demanded without preamble. "Not much," I answered truthfully. "Name's Thomas Blackwood. Said he's looking for someplace quiet. He mentioned where he rode in from. Anyone he knows hereabouts." I shook my head, curiosity pickling. "What's he done to warrant such interest, Sheriff?" Bennett's narrow face tightened, like a fist. "That's official business. You just remember your place, Sullivan. Town's got enough troubles without harboring unknown elements." He departed as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving me pondering what about the solitary stranger had triggered such concern from a man who typically reserved his attention for Maddox's bidding. My question was answered later that afternoon, when Clara Winslow entered my store, once the proud daughter of a prosperous rancher, now reduced to taking in laundry after the Scorpion gang orchestrated her family's downfall. "Heard about the new arrival?" she asked quietly, selecting the cheapest. "Cuts of salt pork with careful deliberation. Blackwood? Met him yesterday. Sheriff's in quite a state about him," she continued, glancing toward the door to ensure privacy. "Seems Judge Haynes received a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office. They're asking questions about recent property transfers. Same day this stranger arrives." Understanding dawned. "They think he's connected to the investigation?" Clara's lips twisted in a bitter smile. "Maddox certainly does. Sent 2 of his boys to welcome Mr. Blackwood to his new home this morning." Alarm flared within me. "Cortez and Durham?" She nodded grimly. "The very same." A lead weight settled in. My stomach. Javier Cortez and Micah Durham were Maddox's preferred messengers when delivering persuasive communications. Few recipients remained capable of coherent conversation afterward. "God help the poor fool," I muttered, already envisioning another tragic accident for Sheriff Bennett to inadequately investigate. Clara's next words froze my blood. "God helped someone all right," she whispered, leaning closer. "They found Durham's horse wandering near Cripple Creek Canyon, saddle empty. Cortez dragged himself into the broken spur an hour ago, looking like he'd seen the devil himself, babbling about how Blackwood moved faster than any natural man has right to. Wouldn't say another word, just knocked back 3 whiskeys and rode out to the Scorpion Ranch. I struggled to reconcile this information with the quiet man who'd stood before my counter. "You're saying he fought off both of them? Alone?" "Fought implies a contest," Clara replied, her eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in Cottonwood. "Springs for a long time, hope, fragile but unmistakable. From what little Cortez said, it was more like a demonstration." As afternoon surrendered to evening, Cottonwood Springs vibrated with rumor. Durham remained unaccounted for, and Cortez refused to leave the Scorpion compound. The saloon buzzed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. With speculative conversation quickly silenced whenever the batwing doors swung open, I was closing my store when Thomas Blackwood appeared so suddenly I nearly dropped my keys. The setting sun cast his features in harsh relief, emphasizing a long scar running along his jawline I hadn't noticed during our first meeting. "Mr. Sullivan," he greeted me with that same formal courtesy. "Might I trouble you for a moment of conversation?" Something in his manner made refusal seem impossible. I invited him inside, lighting a lamp that pushed back the gathering shadows. "I've had visitors," he stated without preamble, standing rather than accepting the chair I offered. "Two men who seemed quite interested in my business here." "I heard," I admitted. "Cortez and Durham aren't known for social calls." The taller one, Cortez was it, seemed particularly eager to convey a message from someone called Scorpion. Blackwood's tone remained conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than what must have been a violent confrontation. Something about certain land parcels not being available for settlement, regardless of what official records might indicate. My mouth went dry. "What happened to Durham?" "He chose poorly," Blackwood replied, a statement that explained nothing, and everything simultaneously. "Tell me, Mr. Sullivan, how long has this Scorpion been extracting your town's lifeblood?" The abrupt shift startled me into honesty. "Almost 2 years now. Started with small demands, protection money from businesses, a percentage from the ranchers. Then they discovered gold on the Richardson property. After that, I trailed off, the progression of events too painful to articulate fully. After that, they became more ambitious," Blackwood finished for me. "Started acquiring properties through your compromised judge, intimidating or eliminating anyone who resisted. You seem remarkably well informed for someone who just arrived," I observed, unease creeping through me. "Information has value," he replied simply. "I make it my business to understand the lay of the land." "What exactly is your business, Mr. Blackwood?" I finally asked the question that had been nagging at me since our first encounter. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gunmetal eyes assessing me with unsettling thoroughness. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room. "Restoration," he said softly, "particularly in places where the natural order has been corrupted." Without further explanation, he bid me good night and vanished into the darkness, leaving me with the unsettling certainty that Cottonwood Springs balanced on the precipice of profound change. Whether that change would bring salvation or destruction remained to be seen. Word of the confrontation at Blackwood's cabin spread through Cottonwood Springs with the speed of a prairie fire. By morning, the entire settlement buzzed with speculation, voices lowered whenever Sheriff Bennett or known Scorpion associates passed nearby. Durham's body was discovered in a ravine near Blackwood's property, his neck broken so cleanly the doctor declared it almost surgical in its precision. Sheriff Bennett wasted no time riding out to the Simmons cabin, deputies flanking him like nervous colts. They returned empty-handed, Bennett's face flushed with frustration. Blackwood had been working his garden when they arrived, seemingly unconcerned by their presence. "Man had the gall to offer us water," Bennett complained loudly. "At the Broken Spur that evening, whiskey loosening his tongue. Standing there cool as you please, asking if we'd come about the unfortunate incident with those trespassers. Said one fell from his horse while fleeing after he declined their generous offer to vacate his rightfully acquired property. You arrest him?" someone dared to ask. Bennett's laugh held no humor. "For what? Defending his homestead? Even Judge Haynes couldn't make that stick, not without witnesses. Besides..." His voice dropped, uncharacteristic uncertainty creeping in. "Something ain't right about that man. Way he holds himself, way he watches, like he's measuring every last one of us for coffins. That evening, Ezekiel Maddox himself rode into town, flanked by his most trusted lieutenants. This unprecedented appearance sent a ripple of apprehension through the community. The Scorpion rarely emerged from his ranch headquarters, preferring to issue commands from a distance like a malevolent spider controlling its web. I watched from my doorway as they dismounted before the judge's office. Maddox, a lean, sallow-faced man whose unremarkable appearance belied his ruthless nature. Victor Hangman Hayes, whose nickname derived from his preferred method of eliminating obstacles. Samuel Quinn, a former cavalry scout whose tracking abilities had ended many attempts at escape. And the hulking Lars Gustafsson, whose capacity for violence was matched only by his unwavering loyalty to Maddox. Their arrival coincided with Thomas Blackwood's second visit to my store. He stood beside me, observing the proceedings with detached interest. "The leadership emerges," he commented quietly. "Unusual for them to show themselves so openly. I must have made quite an impression." "That's Scorpion Maddox himself," I confirmed, unease clawing at my insides. "Never comes to town unless something significant demands his attention. I'm flattered to qualify," Blackwood replied with disconcerting calm. "Tell me, which of his men is most dangerous?" The question caught me off guard. "They're all killers." "That doesn't answer my question, Mr. Sullivan. Among predators, there is always a hierarchy. Which one thinks rather than merely reacts? Which one watches while others speak? I considered the quartet across the street. "Quinn," I decided. "The one in the cavalry jacket. Former army scout. They say he can track a ghost across bare rock. Sees things others miss." Blackwood nodded slightly, as if confirming his own assessment. "And the big one looks formidable but follows rather than leads. The thin one beside Maddox has the eyes of a man who enjoys suffering." His observations were disturbingly accurate. For someone who'd never encountered these men before, as if sensing our attention, Quinn turned suddenly, his gaze locking with Blackwood's across the dusty street. For a suspended moment, they regarded each other with the wary recognition of two wolves, identifying a worthy opponent. Then Maddox barked an order, and the group disappeared into the judge's office. "You should leave town," I found myself saying. "Whatever brought you here, it's not worth facing what's coming." Blackwood's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes hardened to flint. "Some things are worth any price, Mr. Sullivan. Even blood." He departed without purchasing anything, leaving me with the cold certainty that Cottonwood Springs was about to become the arena for a conflict beyond anything in its troubled history. That night, Judge Haynes called an emergency town meeting at the church, the first such gathering since the Scorpion Gang had established their stranglehold. Attendance wasn't explicitly mandatory, but the Scorpion's men, positioned strategically around the settlement, made clear the consequences of absence. The church pews filled with anxious citizens, murmuring among themselves until Maddox entered, flanked by his lieutenants. Judge Haynes followed, his once impressive frame now stooped with the weight of his corruption, his rheumy eyes avoiding contact with the people he'd betrayed. Sheriff Bennett slunk in afterward, positioning himself near the door like a man contemplating escape. Conspicuously absent was Thomas Blackwood. Judge Haynes called for order, his practiced courtroom voice echoing in the tense silence. "Citizens of Cottonwood Springs, we face a potential threat to the peace and prosperity we've worked so hard to establish." Audible scoffs emerged from several corners of the room, quickly silenced by glares from Maddox's men. "A stranger has taken residence in our community," Haynes continued, "a man who may harbor dangerous intentions. Information has reached us suggesting Thomas Blackwood may not be who he claims." At this dramatic pronouncement, the church doors swung open. Every head turned as Blackwood himself entered, moving with that same fluid economy I'd noticed previously. He took a position at the back, leaning against the wall with arms folded across his chest. "Please don't let me interrupt," he called, his voice carrying effortlessly through the crowded space. "I'm quite interested in hearing what information Judge Haynes has uncovered about me." A current of tension electrified the room. Maddox's hand drifted toward his holstered revolver, but Quinn subtly shook his head, a silent warning that this was neither the time nor place. Judge Haynes recovered his composure with visible effort. "Mr. Blackwood, we were just discussing concerns about your sudden appearance in our community, particularly in light of recent incidents." "You mean the unfortunate accident befalling the men who trespassed on my property with expressed intent to harm me?" Blackwood replied, his tone mild but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I've already explained those circumstances to Sheriff Bennett. Or perhaps you're referring to other incidents. The systematic theft of land through fraudulent means. Perhaps the mysterious fires that claim the homes of those who resist. The bodies buried in shallow graves along Cripple Creek." Gasps rippled through the assembly. These things had been known but never spoken aloud in such a public forum. Judge Haynes's face paled, while Maddox's darkened with fury. "You're making dangerous accusations, stranger," Maddox said, his voice carrying the soft menace of a rattlesnake's. "Warning, merely observations," Blackwood countered. "I'm a detail-oriented man, Mr. Maddox. I notice patterns, connections, inconsistencies." His gaze swept the church, meeting the eyes of townspeople one by one. Like how a town, sitting on one of the richest gold deposits in the territory, somehow remains impoverished, while a select few prosper. Or how a judge's rulings invariably favor certain interests. Or how a sheriff investigates crimes without ever finding culprits. Sheriff Bennett surged forward, hand on his gun. "That's enough. You're under arrest for slandering public officials." The silence that followed was absolute. Blackwood hadn't moved, hadn't reached for a weapon, yet something in his posture caused Bennett to freeze mid-stride. "I wouldn't," Blackwood said quietly. "Your draw is slow, Sheriff. 2 seconds by my estimation. I could have emptied your gun, dismantled it and returned it to your holster in that time. The claim was so outrageous it should have provoked laughter. No one laughed. Who are you?" Judge Haynes demanded, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool evening. Blackwood straightened from his relaxed position against the wall. "Just a man seeking peace and quiet, as I've said from the beginning. Whether I find it here depends entirely on how events unfold in the coming days." With a respectful nod to the assembly, he turned and departed, leaving the church doors swinging in his wake. The meeting dissolved into chaos, with accusations and counter-accusations flying between Maddox's supporters and those who had suffered under his regime. I slipped out amidst the confusion, my mind racing. Blackwood's confrontational appearance had transformed something in Cottonwood Springs. He'd given public voice to truths previously whispered in shadows, and in doing so had made it impossible for Maddox to operate with the same impunity. As before, dawn was still hours away when a pounding at my door jolted me from uneasy sleep. I opened it to find Clara Winslow, her face taut with urgency. "They're going after him tonight," she gasped, clutching my arm. "Quinn, Hayes, Gustafson, and 6 others. Maddox gave the order after the meeting. They're gathering at the Broken Spur now, planning to burn him out and make it look like an accident." Cold dread washed through me. "We have to warn him." Clara's grip tightened. "You can't. Quinn's got men watching the trails to Blackwood's cabin. Anyone approaching will be shot before they get within shouting distance." "Then Blackwood is a dead man," I concluded grimly. A strange smile touched Clara's lips. "That's what they said about my father before they hung him from our own barn rafter, but I'm not so sure. There's something about this stranger." She hesitated. My grandmother would have called him a spirit walker, someone whose soul has crossed between worlds and returned changed. The way he moves, the way he sees. She shook her head. Either way, we'll know by morning. As Clara disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, I wrestled with my conscience. The prudent course was to stay locked within my store, as I had during previous acts of scorpion violence. Yet something about Blackwood had awakened a long-dormant sense of responsibility. He had stood alone, giving voice to truths the rest of us had been too cowardly to acknowledge. Making my decision, I grabbed my father's old Henry rifle from beneath the floorboards and slipped out the back way, taking a circuitous route toward the northern hills. I wouldn't reach Blackwood's cabin directly. Quinn's men would ensure that, but I might find a vantage point from which to witness what transpired, perhaps even fire warning shots to alert Blackwood to the approaching danger. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when I found a suitable position overlooking the Simmons cabin from the ridge above. Maddox's men had already arrived, forming a loose circle around the small structure. From my position, I could see Quinn directing their deployment with military precision, ensuring all escape routes were covered. Strangely, no light showed from within the cabin, though a thin curl of smoke from the chimney suggested Blackwood was in residence. The windows remained dark, the door closed. If Blackwood was aware of the approaching threat, he showed no sign of it. As the first golden rays of sunrise spilled across the landscape, Hayes moved toward the cabin door, a torch in one hand and his revolver in the other. The others tensed, weapons trained on every possible exit. What happened next occurred with such bewildering speed that later accounts would contradict one another on the sequence of events. The cabin door swung open before Hayes reached it, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Hayes hesitated, then pitched forward suddenly, as if pulled by invisible hands, disappearing into the black interior. His scream, high and thin with terror, cut through the morning stillness, followed by a gunshot. The remaining men opened fire, peppering the cabin with bullets. Wood splintered, glass shattered, but no return fire came from within. After several seconds, Quinn signaled a ceasefire, the sudden silence ringing in its aftermath. Gustafson took a hesitant step toward the still open door, then another. A dark shape materialized from the shadows beside the cabin, not from within it, and Gustafson dropped without a sound, his massive frame crumpling like abandoned clothing. Panic erupted among Maddox's men. They fired wildly, bullets kicking, up dust but finding no target. One by one they fell, some silently, others with startled cries, as a shadow moved among them with preternatural speed. Quinn alone maintained his composure, tracking the movement with his rifle, waiting for the perfect shot. When it came, he squeezed the trigger with confident precision. The bullet found only empty air. In the split second, it took Quinn to chamber. Another round, Blackwood appeared directly before him, materializing like a spirit from the morning mist. Even from my distant position, I could see Quinn's expression transform from determined focus to bone-deep terror as he gazed upon whatever he saw in Blackwood's face. His rifle clattered to the ground from nerveless fingers. His mouth opened, perhaps to beg, perhaps to curse, but no sound emerged. Blackwood said something to him, words too low for me to discern, then stepped aside, leaving Quinn's path clear. The former scout remained frozen for a suspended moment before turning and stumbling away, his legendary composure shattered beyond recovery. Within minutes, the confrontation had ended. 7 of Maddox's men lay scattered around the cabin, either dead or incapacitated. Hayes and Gustafson were nowhere to be seen. Quinn's diminishing figure fled toward town, his usual ground-covering lope reduced to a desperate, shambling run, and Thomas Blackwood stood calmly before his cabin, surveying the aftermath like a farmer assessing his fields after harvest. As the sun crested the horizon, bathing the scene in golden light, he looked directly toward my hiding place, a distance no ordinary man should have been able to detect a concealed observer. and raised his hand in acknowledgement. In that moment, I knew with bone-deep certainty that Cottonwood Springs had not welcomed a simple settler seeking peace and quiet. We had received something far more primal, an instrument of judgment, a reckoning long overdue. The war for Cottonwood Springs. Soul had begun, and blood had marked its opening salvo. By midday, Quinn's incoherent account of the morning's events had spread through town like wildfire. He'd taken refuge in the Broken Spur, consuming whiskey with single-minded determination while repeating a disjointed narrative that raised more questions than it answered. Not human, he'd muttered to anyone who would listen, his hands trembling violently. Moved like smoke between bullets, eyes like a dead man's, seen everything, forgotten nothing, knew me, knew things I'd done before I ever set foot in this territory. When pressed about Hayes and Gustafson, Quinn would only shake his head and drain another glass. Gone, was all he would say. Just gone. Sheriff Bennett made a show of organizing a posse to investigate, but found few volunteers. By mid-afternoon, he'd abandoned the pretense, retreating to his office and barring the door. As sunset painted Cottonwood Springs in shades of blood and fire, an unfamiliar anticipation gripped the settlement. Something fundamental had shifted. Maddox's seemingly unbreakable hold had been challenged, and whether from hope or dread, every resident understood that the quiet, unremarkable existence we'd known was rushing toward a cataclysmic conclusion. The only question remaining was, who would be left standing when the dust finally settled? The following morning, Cottonwood Springs awakened to an uncanny silence. The usual bustle of commerce and conversation was replaced by a watchful hush, as if the town itself were holding its breath. I opened my store at the customary hour, but found few customers willing to venture onto the main street. Those who did moved quickly, eyes darting toward the ridgeline where Blackwood's cabin perched like a sentinel overlooking our troubled settlement. By mid-morning, the silence was broken by the thunderous approach of riders, not from the direction of Blackwood's property, but from the south. Ezekiel Maddox had summoned reinforcements from neighboring territories, hardened men who owed allegiance to the Scorpion Gang's expanding criminal empire. They rode into town 20 strong, dust-covered and grim-faced, the hoofbeats of their mounts reverberating through the near-empty streets like war drums heralding conflict. I watched their arrival from my doorway, my heart sinking at this display of force. Whatever advantage Blackwood had gained through his night of supernatural defense seemed suddenly diminished in the face of such numbers. Sarah Patterson, the schoolteacher whose outspoken nature had nearly cost her position before Maddox decided. An educated populace better served his long-term ambitions, paused beside me. They look worried, she observed quietly, her keen eyes noting details most would miss. See how they bunch together? How they scan the rooftops? These aren't men riding to an easy victory. She was right. Despite their imposing numbers, Maddox's reinforcements maintained a defensive formation, rifles resting across saddles for immediate use rather than holstered. Their leader, a scar-faced man whose black duster couldn't conceal the bandoliers, crisscrossing his chest, continuously surveyed our surroundings with the hypervigilance of prey rather than predator. News travels fast in outlaw circles, Sarah continued, adjusting her spectacles. Whatever happened at Blackwood's cabin has them spooked before they've even encountered the man himself. They should be, came a new voice, causing both of us to start. Clara Winslow joined us, her expression simultaneously fearful and exhilarated. Quinn's been talking, or trying to. Says Blackwood knew him, called him by his real name. Not Quinn, but Nathaniel Hargrove. Knew about massacres he'd participated in during the Apache campaigns, atrocities never reported to the War Department, things no living soul should know. That's impossible, I countered, though without conviction. Quinn or Hargrove arrived here long after those campaigns ended. How could Blackwood know such things? Clara's response chilled me despite the morning heat. Quinn thinks he's encountered a dead man walking, says Blackwood mentioned being present at Willow Creek. The significance wasn't lost on me. The Willow Creek massacre, that was 15 years ago. An entire settlement wiped out by renegade soldiers. No survivors? Apparently, Clara whispered, one man survived, and he's been hunting those responsible ever since. Before I could process this revelation, Maddox himself emerged from the Broken Spur saloon, where he'd established temporary headquarters. At his side walked a new figure, tall and skeletally thin, dressed entirely in black despite the desert heat. His face remained shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but something in his bearing caused the crowd of onlookers to instinctively withdraw. "The Confessor," Sarah breathed, making the sign of the cross reflexively. The name meant nothing to me, but the reaction it provoked in both women was telling. "Who?" I asked, keeping my voice low, as Maddox and his companions surveyed the new arrivals. "Absalom Crane," Clara explained, her voice trembling slightly. "They call him the Confessor because he extracts confessions through means that make ordinary torture seem merciful. He was a Union interrogator during the war, but the army discharged him for methods too extreme, even for that bloody conflict. Rumor says he spent time in an asylum before Maddox recruited him. He's brought him for Blackwood," Sarah concluded grimly. "When bullets fail, Maddox resorts to monsters of a different kind." As if sensing our discussion, Crane turned slowly in our direction. Though I couldn't discern his features clearly, I felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch, cold and assessing. After a moment that stretched painfully, he returned his focus to Maddox, who was now issuing orders to the newly arrived gunmen. "We should separate," Clara suggested urgently. "Being seen talking together will only draw unwanted attention." She and Sarah drifted away in opposite directions, leaving me alone in my doorway as Maddox's reinforcements dispersed throughout Cottonwood Springs, establishing a presence at every strategic location. 2 men took position across from my store, their posture casual, but their eyes alert. The message was clear. Maddox was preparing for Blackwood's inevitable appearance in town, transforming our settlement into an elaborate trap. By afternoon, Judge Haynes had posted a notice declaring Thomas Blackwood a fugitive, wanted for multiple murders. The ludicrous nature of this development, charging a man for defending himself against armed attackers on his own property, might once have passed without comment in Cottonwood Springs. But something had changed. Small groups of residents gathered before the notice, murmuring among themselves with unprecedented boldness. "Self-defense ain't murder," I overheard Jacob Miller, our blacksmith, declare to nodding agreement. "Not by any law I recognize." Such open dissent would have been unthinkable days earlier. Blackwood's defiance had kindled something long dormant. In our community, the ember of resistance, small but intensifying with each passing hour. As sunset approached, I received an unexpected visitor. Matthew Langley, once our town's physician before drink and despair reduced him to tending minor ailments in exchange for whiskey, stumbled into my store shortly before closing. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, but his manner conveyed urgent purpose rather than mere intoxication. "Need supplies," he rasped, pushing a crumpled list across my counter. "Bandages, laudanum, suturing materials, whatever you've got." I scanned the list, recognition dawning. "These are medical. Supplies? Your powers of observation remain undiminished," Langley replied sarcastically, glancing nervously toward the window where one of Maddox's men loitered across the street. "For Blackwood." I kept my voice barely above a whisper. Langley's roomy eyes met mine with sudden clarity. Lost my practice, my reputation, nearly my sanity watching men like Maddox crush decent folk beneath their boots. "Maybe I can't save this town, but I can at least patch up the man willing to try." He leaned closer, breath sour with cheap whiskey. "He's planning something, Sullivan. Says it ends tonight." "He's in town," I asked, alarmed, "with every hired gun in the territory looking for him?" A ghost of Langley's former intelligence flickered across his ravaged features. "Been here since dawn, moving unseen, learning, watching." He tapped his temple significantly. "Man thinks differently than ordinary folk, sees patterns, weaknesses, says Maddox has made a fundamental error, bringing all his forces to one location." As I gathered the requested supplies, a cold certainty settled in my chest. Cottonwood Springs was about to become a battlefield, with every resident caught in the crossfire. I added extra bandages and medicines to Langley's order, then hesitated before including my father's old service revolver, wrapped inconspicuously in brown paper. "I never saw this," Langley nodded, understanding my unspoken message. "And you never saw me." After he departed, I found myself unable to close my store. Some nebulous anticipation kept me rooted there, arranging and rearranging items with mechanical precision as darkness claimed the town. Oil lamps bloomed in windows, their light doing little to dispel the growing sense of impending calamity. Shortly after full dark, the first gunshot shattered the tense quiet. It came from the direction of the sheriff's office, followed immediately by shouts and running footsteps. Maddox's men converged on the location, weapons drawn. From my vantage point, I could see confusion spreading through their ranks as contradictory orders were shouted across the darkened street. A second shot rang out, this time from the opposite direction, near the stables. Then a third from behind. The church. The pattern became clear even to me. Blackwood was creating a diversion, drawing attention to multiple locations simultaneously. The true purpose of this strategy revealed itself moments later, when tongues of flame erupted from the upper story of the Broken Spur Saloon, Maddox's temporary headquarters. Fire spread with supernatural speed, suggesting careful preparation. Within minutes, the building had become a roaring inferno, silhouetting the figures of men stumbling from its interior, coughing and disoriented. Among them was Ezekiel Maddox himself, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his face blackened with soot. As he staggered into the street, a single shot rang out. Maddox jerked violently, clutching his shoulder, then dove for cover behind a water trough as a second bullet splintered the wood near his head. The message was unmistakable. Blackwood could have killed him, but had chosen instead to wound and terrorize. This was not mere combat. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. What followed could only be described as orchestrated chaos. Shots came from multiple directions, creating the impression of numerous attackers. Maddox's men fired blindly into shadows, occasionally striking one another in their panic. The disciplined force that had ridden into town that morning disintegrated into disorganized individuals, each concerned primarily with self-preservation. Through it all, I caught only glimpses of Blackwood, a figure moving fluidly between pools of darkness, appearing and vanishing with ghostly efficiency. His strategy became increasingly apparent. He was not attempting to eliminate Maddox's entire force, but rather to isolate and extract specific targets. I watched, transfixed, as he systematically separated the leadership from their subordinates. Judge Haynes was the first to disappear, yanked into an alley while fleeing the burning saloon. Sheriff Bennett followed shortly after, his desperate flight toward the livery stable interrupted by a shadow that detached itself from a darkened doorway. Even in the chaotic firelight, I recognized the precision with which Blackwood disabled the corrupt lawman, a single blow rendering him unconscious before dragging him from view. The confessor proved more challenging prey. When Blackwood finally cornered him near the church, Crane revealed himself as no ordinary adversary. The skeletal man moved with surprising agility, producing twin daggers from beneath his coat. What followed was a lethal dance, unlike anything I'd witnessed, Blackwood's fluid speed against Crane's macabre precision. Their confrontation ended abruptly when Clara Winslow emerged unexpectedly from the church, wielding her father's shotgun. The momentary distraction allowed Blackwood to disarm Crane with a move too swift to follow. The confessor's terrible scream echoed across town as his arm twisted at an impossible angle. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the shattered limb, as Blackwood delivered a knockout blow to his temple. By midnight, the fire at the broken spur had been contained, though the building itself was beyond salvation. Maddox had vanished during the confusion, along with the most loyal of his remaining men. The rest had either fled or surrendered to the impromptu citizens' militia that formed under Jacob Miller's leadership when it became clear which way the wind was blowing. I found myself part of a group gathered outside the church, where Blackwood had established a temporary holding area for his captives. Judge Haynes, Sheriff Bennett, and the confessor sat bound and silent, their expressions ranging from defiant to terrified. Several of Maddox's higher-ranking men joined them, all secured under the watchful eye of armed townspeople who days earlier would never have dared raise a hand against Scorpion authority. Blackwood himself stood slightly apart, his lean frame silhouetted against the smouldering remains of the saloon. In the flickering light, I could finally study the man who had single-handedly dismantled a criminal empire in a single night. His appearance remained unremarkable, weathered but not ancient, strong but not imposing. His distinction lay not in physical attributes but in presence, an absolute stillness that made even the air around him seem charged with potential energy. Maddox escaped, Sarah Patterson reported, joining him with a rifle propped casually against her shoulder. Took 4 men and rode south, according to witnesses. Blackwood nodded, unsurprised. He'll seek reinforcements at his main compound. It's what I do. You let him go deliberately, I realized, voicing the thought aloud as I approached. You could have taken him during the initial confusion, but chose not to. Blackwood's gunmetal eyes assessed me with that same penetrating intensity I'd encountered during our first meeting. Capturing Maddox here would have ended only a fraction of the evil he's created. I need him to lead me to the heart of the Scorpion's nest. So tonight was just... what? A prelude? Jacob Miller asked incredulously. Tonight, Blackwood replied. His voice, soft but carrying, was about showing Cottonwood Springs that ordinary people have extraordinary strength when they stand together. The real battle hasn't even begun. As if to punctuate his statement, Judge Haynes suddenly found his voice, his usual judicial pomposity, transformed to pleading desperation. You can't do this. I'm a federal appointee. There are procedures, legal protocols. Legal protocols, Blackwood interrupted, turning toward the bound judge with deliberate slowness. Like those you employed when condemning innocent landowners to destitution. Or perhaps you refer to the legal protocols governing your acceptance of bribes and participation in murder conspiracies. He approached Haynes with measured steps. Though no weapon was visible in his hands, the judge recoiled, as if facing an imminent execution. You will receive the very justice you've denied others, Blackwood continued, his tone unchanged yet somehow more terrible for its quietness. Every man you've wronged, every family you've destroyed through your corruption, they will testify. Their evidence has been gathered, preserved, protected against the very day you now face. He turned to address the gathered townspeople, his gaze sweeping across faces that showed emotions ranging from vengeance to uncertainty. Dawn brings a choice to Cottonwood Springs, he announced. Continue as you were, pretending blindness to corruption, or rebuild on a foundation of actual justice. I've removed obstacles, but what rises in their place depends entirely on you. With those words, he withdrew from the circle of firelight, disappearing into shadows as completely as if he'd never existed. The captives remained, the citizens' militia stood firm. But the architect of Cottonwood Springs' liberation had vanished like morning mist before the rising sun. The battle for our town's soul had been engaged, but as I watched Clara Winslow organize guards for the prisoners with newfound authority, I understood that Blackwood had orchestrated more than just Maddox's defeat. He had awakened something in us, the courage to reclaim what had been stolen, not just in property, but in dignity and self-determination. And somewhere in the darkness beyond our lamplight, I knew he was already planning the next phase of a reckoning years in the making. The scorpion had suffered a grievous wound, but wounded creatures are often at their most dangerous. The true test of Blackwood's crusade and of Cottonwood Springs' redemption still awaited on the blood-red horizon of tomorrow's dawn. Dawn that followed Cottonwood Springs' night of fire and reckoning brought no peace. Instead, it illuminated a town transformed, awakened, vigilant, and bracing for the inevitable counterstrike. I'd barely slept, spending the pre-dawn hours helping Jacob Miller's newly formed citizen militia secure the prisoners and establish watch positions throughout our settlement. Judge Haynes, Sheriff Bennett, and Absalom Crane remained under heavy guard in the church basement, joined by 7 of Maddox's captured men. Their futures remained uncertain, a question that sparked heated debate among townspeople who had suffered under their corruption, yet hesitated at the prospect of frontier justice. As morning light strengthened, I found Sarah Patterson near the blackened skeleton of the broken spur, meticulously documenting the previous night's events in her schoolteacher's precise handwriting. "Historical record," she explained, without looking up from her work. "When territorial authorities finally investigate this mess, we'll need more than just conflicting testimonies. If they investigate," I countered. "Maddox's influence extends beyond just Cottonwood Springs." Sarah's quill paused mid-sentence. "Precisely why this documentation matters. Corruption thrives in shadows, Mr. Sullivan, but carefully preserved evidence shines inconvenient light into the darkest corners." She adjusted her spectacles with ink-stained fingers. "Have you seen our mystery man this morning?" "Blackwood?" I shook my head. "Not since he vanished last night, though his handiwork is evident everywhere." Indeed, throughout the morning, townspeople discovered caches of documents hidden in locations throughout Cottonwood Springs. Ledgers detailing Judge Haynes's financial arrangements with Maddox, correspondence implicating Sheriff Bennett in orchestrated accidents, maps identifying the properties targeted for seizure based on suspected gold deposits. How Blackwood had obtained these materials remained a mystery, but their impact was undeniable. The paper trail transformed vague suspicions into irrefutable evidence. "Remarkable preparation," Sarah mused, almost as if he'd been gathering intelligence for months, not days. Before I could respond, a commotion near the general store drew our attention. Clara Winslow stood on the boardwalk, addressing a group of anxious-looking homesteaders who had arrived from outlying properties. "Safest in numbers," she was saying as we approached. "Maddox will return with force, and isolated homesteads will be vulnerable to reprisals." "Abandoning our land is exactly what they want," argued Elijah Thornton, whose small ranch lay 3 miles north. "The minute we leave, they'll claim it abandoned." "Better abandoned than burned with your family inside," Clara countered sharply. "We have a defensive position here, weapons, organization. What do you have out there except vulnerability?" The debate might have continued indefinitely had a lone rider not appeared at the far end of the main street, approaching at a deliberate pace that immediately commanded attention. Every conversation ceased as Thomas Blackwood returned to Cottonwood Springs in broad daylight, his copper-colored Morgan moving with the same fluid precision as its master. He dismounted before the gathering, his movements economical, yet somehow graceful. Though he showed no obvious injuries from the previous night's conflict, new lines of fatigue marked his weathered face. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly despite its quiet tone. Mr. Thornton's concerns are valid, as are Miss Winslow's warnings. Both perspectives reflect fragments of the situation we now face. "Where have you been?" Clara demanded, neither intimidated by his sudden appearance nor acknowledging his attempt at diplomacy. "Reconnaissance," Blackwood replied simply. "Maddox reached his main compound shortly before dawn. He's gathering every man who owes him allegiance within a 100-mile radius. They'll ride by nightfall tomorrow, at least 30 strong." This pronouncement sent a ripple of dismay through the assembled townspeople. Jacob Miller stepped forward, his blacksmith's apron incongruous with the shotgun cradled in his massive arms. 30 against what? A dozen townsmen with limited shooting experience? Even with surprise on our side, those odds are suicide. "Which is why we won't fight them on their terms," Blackwood responded. His gaze swept the gathering, assessing. Each face as a general might inspect troops before battle. "Mrs. Thornton, your husband mentioned your property 3 miles north. Does it include the narrow pass through the limestone ridge?" Elizabeth Thornton started at being directly addressed. "The Devil's Throat?" "Yes, it cuts through our northern grazing land, only passage for wagons between here and the high country. And the only practical approach if Maddox brings a sizable force from his compound." Blackwood nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "That pass can be defended by 6 determined men with proper positioning. The terrain will neutralize their numerical advantage." Understanding dawned across the gathering. Blackwood wasn't planning a desperate last stand in Cottonwood Springs. He was orchestrating a strategic defense, targeting the very route Maddox must use. "You want us to ambush them at the Devil's Throat?" Jacob concluded, thoughtfully stroking his beard. "Risky, but if we could damage them before they even reach town—" "Not damage," Blackwood corrected. "Eliminate. Every man who accompanies Maddox tomorrow has chosen his path with full knowledge of the Scorpion's methods. There will be no innocent parties among them." His cold certainty sent a shiver through the assembly. This was not the language of law, enforcement, or even traditional justice. It was the implacable logic of an executioner. And afterwards, Sarah Patterson's clear voice cut through the murmurs. "What happens when the territorial authorities finally respond to reports of mass casualties in a town in rebellion? Do we face a firing squad for taking justice into our own hands?" Blackwood turned toward her, and for the first time since his arrival in Cottonwood Springs, a hint of genuine respect showed in his otherwise inscrutable expression. "A legitimate concern, Miss Patterson, which is why Judge Haynes and his conspirators must face formal charges rather than frontier justice. Their trial will legitimize everything that follows." From the inside pocket of his weathered coat, he produced several official-looking documents bearing territorial seals. Telegrams were sent 3 days ago to the territorial capital detailing the situation here. These arrest warrants arrived at Copper Creek Station this morning. I took the liberty of collecting them. Astonishment rippled through the gathering. Blackwood had not only orchestrated a rebellion, but had simultaneously laid the groundwork for its legal justification. His foresight bordered on the preternatural. "You've been planning this since before you even arrived," I realized aloud. Blackwood's gunmetal eyes met mine, neither confirming nor denying my assertion. Something in their depth suggested calculations beyond my comprehension, patterns within patterns extending back through years rather than days. "What matters now is preparation," he redirected, addressing the entire gathering. "We have 36 hours before Maddox arrives with his force. Each must be used efficiently." What followed was a masterclass in tactical organization. Blackwood divided the townspeople into specialized groups, some tasked with fortifying defensible positions along the Devil's Throat, others with evacuating vulnerable residents to the cave network east of town. Still others with securing provisions and medical supplies for what promised to be a bloody confrontation. Throughout the day, Blackwood moved among these groups, instructing, adjusting, occasionally, demonstrating techniques with hands that revealed decades of hard-won experience. He spoke little of himself, deflecting personal questions with practiced ease. Yet something in his methodical preparations revealed more than any confession might have. This was not his first war, not by far. As afternoon faded toward evening, I found myself assigned to inventory our limited ammunition supplies alongside Dr. Langley, whose newfound sobriety seemed directly proportional to the gravity of our situation. We worked in the back room of my store, counting cartridges and organizing them by caliber when Clara Winslow entered, her expression troubled. "Absalom Crane is asking to speak with Blackwood," she reported. "Says he has critical information about Maddox's true plans, information worth his freedom." "The confessor can rot," Langley spat, his hands trembling slightly as he sorted rifle ammunition. "After what he's done to Maddox's enemies, he deserves nothing but a rope." "Blackwood thinks otherwise," Clara countered. "He's interviewing him now. Curiosity overrode my better judgment." "I should check our supplies at the church anyway," I offered, ignoring Langley's knowing smirk. I found Blackwood and Crane in the church's small antechamber, separated by a heavy oak table. The confessor's injured arm had been set and bandaged, but he remained securely bound to his chair. His skeletal features, fully visible now without his wide-brimmed hat, were even more disturbing in daylight, hollow-cheeked, with eyes set too deep in their sockets, giving him the appearance of a walking cadaver. "Diversionary force," Crane was saying as I entered, his voice a dry rasp like autumn leaves skittering across tombstones. "The main attack will come from the east, through the abandoned mining tunnels. 30 men, possibly more, bypassing your ambush position entirely." Blackwood showed no reaction to this apparent revelation of his strategic vulnerability. "The eastern tunnels collapsed 3 years ago. Even Maddox wouldn't risk sending men through unstable shafts." Crane's lipless mouth twisted into what might have been a smile. "The collapse was staged. Maddox has maintained a secret passage for moving gold without taxation. I've used it myself on multiple occasions." Throughout this exchange, Blackwood studied Crane with the detached interest of a naturalist observing a particularly venomous specimen. "And you're offering this information because—" "Survival," Crane answered without hesitation. "Maddox will fail here. I've seen enough men like you to recognize an inevitable outcome. When he falls, I have no intention of falling with him." "Noble sentiment from a man who extracts confessions through torture," I interjected, unable to contain my disgust. Crane's sunken eyes shifted to me, regarding me with the clinical disinterest of a butcher assessing a particularly unimpressive cut of meat. "Principles are luxuries, storekeeper. Some of us recognized that truth during the war, while others clung to outdated notions of honor until it destroyed them." "Is that what happened at Willow Creek?" Blackwood asked, his tone casual yet laced with something darker. "Principles becoming inconvenient luxuries?" The effect of these words on Crane was instantaneous and profound. The blood drained from his already pallid features, and a tremor passed through his frame that had nothing to do with his injured arm. "You can't possibly know about that," he whispered, genuine fear replacing his previous calculation. "No one survived to—" He stopped abruptly, realization dawning in his cavernous eyes as he truly looked at Blackwood for perhaps the first time. "You're him, the ghost they claimed to see in the aftermath, the one who—" "Your information about the tunnels," Blackwood interrupted, rising with sudden finality. "Is it accurate?" Crane nodded mechanically, shock still evident in his expression. "Then perhaps you've purchased another day of existence," Blackwood concluded, turning toward the door. "Mr. Sullivan will escort you back to your cell." As I moved to comply, Crane found his voice again. "He ordered it, you know. Maddox, Willow Creek was his operation from the beginning. I was just following orders, Blackwood finished for him, pausing at the threshold. The coward's eternal justification. Without another glance at the confessor, he departed, leaving an atmosphere heavy with unspoken histories. I returned Crane to his cell in the church basement, my mind racing with implications. The reference to Willow Creek had clearly opened. Some terrible chapter from the past, a chapter in which both Blackwood and Maddox had played significant roles. The ghost Crane mentioned. Could it be mere coincidence that the same term had been applied to Blackwood's uncanny abilities during last night's conflict? By the time I emerged from the church, the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across a town transformed by barricades and defensive preparations. I found Blackwood at the stables, examining the hooves of his copper Morgan with methodical care. Was Crane telling the truth, I asked without preamble, about the mining tunnels? Yes, Blackwood replied without looking up from his task. Though not the whole truth. The tunnels exist, but they're more vulnerable than he suggested. With proper preparation, they become a trap rather than an avenue of attack. And Willow Creek, was he telling the truth about that too? Blackwood's hands stilled momentarily, the only indication that my question had struck a nerve. When he finally straightened and turned toward me, his expression remained impassive, but something smoldered in the depths of his grey eyes, something ancient and terrible. Some truths are better left buried, Mr. Sullivan, at least until all accounts are settled. These people are risking everything based on your guidance, I pressed, gesturing toward the bustling activity throughout town. Don't they deserve to know exactly who they're following? What personal vendetta might be clouding your judgment? For a moment I feared I'd pushed too far. A dangerous stillness settled over Blackwood, his weathered features hardening into something barely recognizable as human. Then, with visible effort, he reined himself back from whatever precipice I'd driven him toward. 15 years ago, he began, his voice low enough that I had to lean closer to hear, Willow Creek was a mining settlement much like Cottonwood Springs, small, isolated, of little interest to anyone except those who called it home. Until gold was discovered in quantities sufficient to attract attention. He ran a hand along his horse's flank, the automatic gesture seeming to anchor him as he continued. Ezekiel Maddox was a lieutenant then, serving under a colonel who shared his appetites for wealth and cruelty. They led a detachment of cavalry ostensibly dispatched to protect the settlement from indigenous raids. Instead, they systematically eliminated every resident, men, women, children, and reported the massacre as the work of Apache warriors. The coldness in his recitation made the horror all the more palpable. This wasn't a second-hand account, but the testimony of someone who had witnessed these atrocities firsthand. The official record states no survivors, he continued, and officially that's correct. Thomas Blackwood died at Willow Creek alongside his wife and infant son. The man who emerged from that charnel house days later was something else entirely. A vessel for retribution, methodically hunting those responsible across 15 years and thousands of miles. You're saying you're a ghost, he finished, meeting my gaze directly. In every way that matters. The living man died that day. What remained had only one purpose, to ensure that every participant in that massacre faced judgment for their crimes. The implacable certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. Whatever Blackwood had once been, soldier, miner, family man, had been burned away in the crucible of Willow Creek, leaving only this instrument of vengeance. How many, I asked, uncertain I wanted the answer. How many of them have you judged before coming here? 24, he answered without hesitation, each confronted with their crimes. Each offered the opportunity to face formal justice. Most chose resistance instead, and Maddox is the last. Something like grim satisfaction flickered across Blackwood's features. The orchestrator, the one most deserving of judgment, tomorrow, brings the culmination of 15 years' work, Mr. Sullivan. I would have preferred to face him alone, but his connection to Cottonwood Springs made that impossible. So we're just collateral elements in your personal crusade. Blackwood shook his head, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. No, you're unexpected allies in a battle that serves both justice and your community's liberation. Our purposes align, even if our motivations differ. Before I could respond, Jacob Miller approached with urgent news. Scouts had spotted riders approaching from the south, not the large force expected tomorrow, but a smaller group moving with evident purpose. Not Maddox's men, Jacob reported. Different, professional-looking, led by a man in an army coat. Blackwood's response surprised me with its intensity. How many? 6, maybe 7. Carrying Springfield rifles. Military bearing. Without another word, Blackwood strode toward the town's southern approach, his hand finally moving to the revolver that had remained conspicuously holstered throughout our conversation. Something in the news had clearly alarmed him more than the prospect of facing Maddox's entire force. I followed at a distance, arriving at the edge of town as the riders came into clear view. They were indeed military in appearance, well-armed, disciplined in formation, led by a broad-shouldered man whose cavalry coat had seen considerable service. As they drew closer, Blackwood's posture changed, not tensing for combat, but straightening with what appeared to be recognition. "Captain McAllister," he called out when the riders were within hailing distance, "you're 3 days early." The leader reined his mount to a halt, studying Blackwood with narrowed eyes before breaking into a weathered smile. "And you're exactly where you said you'd be, you old ghost, though it appears you've started the party without us." A complex emotion crossed Blackwood's face, something between relief and reluctance, as if welcoming necessary reinforcements while regretting their necessity. The newcomers dismounted with military precision, their leader approaching Blackwood with the familiar ease of long acquaintance. "Federal marshals," Blackwood explained to the gathering crowd of curious townspeople. "Specifically, a specialized detachment tasked with dismantling criminal organizations in the territories." Captain McAllister surveyed our improvised fortifications with professional assessment. "Seems you've mobilized the locals effectively. Typical Blackwood. Why bring an army when you can create one on site?" "Necessity rather than preference," Blackwood replied. "Maddox has consolidated more power than anticipated. His counterattack will be substantial." McAllister nodded grimly. "So our informants suggested. That's why we forced the pace, nearly killed our mounts getting here ahead of schedule." He gestured toward his men, who were already integrating themselves into our defensive positions, with practiced efficiency. Not the full detachment I'd hoped for, but all veterans of Antelope Ridge and Jackson's Gulch. They remember what we're facing. The names meant nothing to me, but clearly resonated with Blackwood. Some of the tension visibly left his frame, not completely, but enough to suggest these newcomers represented a significant improvement in our odds. "How soon until the rest of your men arrive?" he asked. McAllister's expression tightened. "That's the other news. There won't be reinforcements. Maddox's influence reached higher than we realized. The territorial governor has suspended our operation pending review of procedural concerns." "Convenient timing," Blackwood observed dryly. "Remarkably so," McAllister agreed. "Fortunately, our detachment was already en route when the recall order arrived. Terrible shame about the communications breakdown that prevented us from receiving it." His wink conveyed volumes about his willingness to operate beyond official sanction when circumstances demanded. As the marshals integrated themselves into our preparations, I found myself alongside McAllister, helping distribute additional ammunition. From their saddlebags, The captain worked with efficient purpose, but I sensed his willingness to satisfy at least some of my evident curiosity. "You've known Blackwood a long time," I ventured, phrasing it as statement rather than question. McAllister measured me with a calculating gaze before responding. "Since the war. Served under him when he commanded a specialized scout unit, men selected for particular skills rather than conventional military virtues. Most effective outfit I ever encountered." He paused, checking a rifle's action with practiced hands. "After Willow Creek, many of us helped with his personal mission. You know what happened there?" The marshal's expression darkened. "I helped bury what remained of the settlement, saw things no man should witness. When Blackwood emerged 3 days later, a man we'd counted among the dead, some called it a miracle, others something else entirely." His voice dropped. "Man who survived what he endured is no longer entirely of this world, Mr. Sullivan. He walks a boundary between life and death that most of us never even glimpse. Yet you follow him, because he never strays from the path of justice, no matter how difficult the terrain." McAllister secured his ammunition crate with a decisive motion. "Blackwood isn't just seeking personal vengeance, though, God knows. He's entitled to it. He's preventing Maddox from creating more Willow Creeks. The Scorpion's operation here is just the beginning of something far larger. A criminal empire stretching across 3 territories, built on intimidation, corruption, and murder." This perspective reframed everything I'd witnessed since Blackwood's arrival. Not simply a lone avenger settling personal scores, but a calculated operation against a growing threat, one with implications far beyond our isolated settlement. As sunset painted Cottonwood Springs in amber and crimson, our preparations accelerated. The marshal's arrival had injected fresh confidence into our improvised militia, transforming anxious civilians into something approaching a cohesive fighting force. Under McAllister's guidance, defensive positions were refined, communication protocols established, ammunition distributed according to shooting proficiency rather than personal preference. Throughout it all, Blackwood moved with increasing purpose, as if proximity to his ultimate objective had stripped away whatever humanity he still affected. His instructions came with clipped precision, his gaze distant even when addressing those directly before him. The mask of the settler had fallen away completely, revealing the instrument of judgment beneath. As darkness claimed the land, I found him alone atop the church bell tower, surveying the moonlit landscape with the focused intensity of a hawk sighting prey. I'd climbed up, intending to report on our final preparations, but something in his solitary vigilance gave me pause. "They'll come from both directions," he said without turning, somehow aware of my presence despite my silent approach. "The mining, tunnels, and the Devil's Throat simultaneously, hoping to catch us between converging forces. How can you be certain?" I asked, joining him at the railing. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Because it's what I would do." The simple statement revealed more about Blackwood than hours of explanation might have. His effectiveness stemmed not from supernatural abilities, but from an uncanny understanding of his adversaries. An understanding born of sharing their darkest capabilities, if not their motivations. "You're not what I expected," I admitted, watching his profile in the silvery moonlight. "Few of us are in the final accounting," he replied cryptically. "We begin as one thing, become another through circumstance and choice. The man who settled at Willow Creek seeking peace after the war's horrors shares little with the one standing before you now. And after tomorrow, when Maddox is dealt with, what then?" For the first time since I'd known him, Blackwood seemed genuinely uncertain. "I've given little thought to afterward. 15 years of single-minded purpose leaves little room for contemplating its absence." The vulnerability in this admission was more unsettling than his usual implacable certainty. I realized with sudden clarity that Blackwood had never expected to survive his mission, that vengeance and death had become so intertwined in his conception that one necessarily implied the other. "There's a future beyond tomorrow," I suggested, carefully, "one where your skills and determination could rebuild rather than merely avenge." He turned toward me then, something almost human flickering across his weathered features. Before he could respond, however, a sharp whistle cut through the night, the alarm signal we'd established for incoming riders. "They're early," Blackwood observed, instantly reverting to the precision instrument of warfare. Maddox must have learned of the marshal's arrival. In the silver moonlight flooding the valley, we could see them, a substantial force approaching along the main road, moving with the confidence of superior numbers. At the same moment, McAllister appeared at the bell tower stairway. "Movement at the eastern mineshaft," he reported tersely. "Second force emerging exactly as anticipated." Blackwood nodded, unperturbed by this development. "Signal Jacob Miller to initiate our response at the tunnels. Captain, take your men to reinforce the southern barricade. Mr. Sullivan, ensure the non-combatants are secured in the designated shelter." As we moved to comply with these instructions, Blackwood's voice stopped me momentarily. "Tomorrow has its own concerns, Mr. Sullivan. Tonight, we ensure there is a tomorrow for Cottonwood Springs." With that, he descended into the gathering conflict, his movements fluid and purposeful, a man finally confronting the destiny toward which 15 years of single-minded purpose had driven him. The ghost of Willow Creek had found its haunting ground, and Ezekiel Maddox would soon face the reckoning long postponed. The war for Cottonwood Springs had begun in earnest, with the town caught between hammer and anvil. Yet, as I hurried to evacuate, the vulnerable to safety, I felt a strange confidence. We faced overwhelming odds, but we had something Maddox and his forces lacked. A guardian who had already traversed death and returned with its terrible knowledge, a man for whom failure was an inconceivable outcome. Whether that made Thomas Blackwood our salvation or something far more troubling remained to be seen. But as gunfire erupted at the settlement's edge, one certainty remained. By dawn, Cottonwood Springs would be transformed forever, either liberated from tyranny or reduced to another Willow Creek, another tragic footnote in the territory's bloody history. History rarely records the sounds of its most pivotal moments, the cacophony that accompanies the transitions between epochs, the audio backdrop to transformation. If it did, the battle for Cottonwood Springs would be remembered not merely for its outcome, but for its terrible symphony, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing between buildings, the thunder of dynamite collapsing mining tunnels, the percussive rhythm of hoofbeats as riders maneuvered through darkness, and beneath it all, the human sounds of conflict. Orders shouted across chaotic distances, cries of the wounded, the occasional eerie silence when combatants held breath and position, each waiting for the other to reveal themselves. I witnessed the opening movements from the relative safety of the church's root cellar, where we'd relocated the elderly, injured, and children. My task complete, I should have remained there, offering what comfort I could to those huddled in darkness. Instead, some compulsion drove me upward, back into the conflict, not to fight, for I had no illusions about my combat effectiveness, but to bear witness. Someone needed to survive who had seen the truth with unclouded eyes, whatever the outcome. The initial assault came exactly as Blackwood had predicted, a pincer movement designed to catch our defenders between converging forces. What Maddox couldn't have anticipated was our foreknowledge of his strategy, allowing Blackwood and McAllister to prepare a reception far different from what the Scorpion's men expected. The Eastern force, emerging from the supposedly secret mining tunnels, found themselves caught in a devastating ambush. Jacob Miller and his blacksmith's assistants had rigged strategic support beams with explosives, waiting until the majority of attackers had entered the narrow passage before collapsing it behind them. Those not crushed outright were trapped between fallen rock and a determined group of defenders positioned behind overturned mining carts reinforced with iron plating. From my vantage point at the church's rear window, I could see the flash of muzzles in the darkness, hear the confused shouting as Maddox's men realized their supposed surprise attack had transformed into a killing box. Within 20 minutes, gunfire from that direction had ceased entirely, replaced by the sound of Jacob's bass voice accepting surrenders. The southern assault proved more challenging. Maddox himself led this larger force, and unlike his miners' tunnel complement, these were experienced gunmen who adapted quickly when they realized they'd lost the element of surprise. They separated into smaller units, using the outbuildings and irrigation ditches surrounding the town for cover as they probed our defenses. I caught glimpses of Captain McAllister directing his marshals and our citizen volunteers with hand signals, and quiet commands shifting defenders to counter each of Maddox's thrusts with remarkable prescience. The discipline of the federal marshals proved decisive during these early exchanges, their aimed fire exacting a steady toll on attackers while minimizing our casualties. Through it all, I sought without success to locate Blackwood. Unlike McAllister, who commanded from visible positions, the architect of our resistance seemed to have vanished once again. I later learned from Sarah Patterson that he had moved among our defensive positions like a ghost, materializing where needed most, eliminating key threats with surgical precision before disappearing again. 3 times he had saved defenders from flanking attacks they never saw coming, his uncanny awareness of the battlefield transcending ordinary perception. The tide turned approximately 2 hours into the engagement. Maddox, frustrated by his inability to breach our perimeter through conventional tactics, ordered a concentrated assault on what he perceived as our weakest point. The livery stable area defended primarily by townspeople rather than marshals. He personally led a group of his most trusted gunmen in a bold charge, clearly hoping to overwhelm through sheer aggression what he couldn't overcome through strategy. It was a fatal miscalculation. The apparent vulnerability was Blackwood's carefully crafted illusion, with our most capable marksmen concealed in elevated positions overlooking the seemingly undermanned barricade. As Maddox's force committed to their charge, these hidden defenders opened fire from 3 directions simultaneously, creating a devastating crossfire. What followed was less battle than execution. Within moments, more than half of Maddox's elite force lay dead or wounded in the dusty street, the survivors scrambling for whatever cover they could find. Maddox himself took a bullet through the shoulder, but managed to retreat behind an overturned wagon, pinned down but still very much in the fight. "Blackwood!" he bellowed into the momentary silence following this devastating reversal. "I know you're out there. This isn't about these people. It's about Willow Creek. Face me directly, you coward!" His words echoed across the battleground, clarifying for everyone what those closest to Blackwood had already pieced together. This conflict transcended Cottonwood Springs, rooted in some terrible history between these 2 men. The response, when it came, emerged from shadows even. I hadn't realized concealed a human figure. Blackwood stepped into the moonlight not 30 yards from Maddox's position, exposed and seemingly unconcerned by the half-dozen weapons that immediately trained on him. 15 years, Ezekiel, he called, his voice carrying that same calm certainty. I'd noted upon our first meeting, 15 years I've hunted you across these territories. Every conspirator, every accomplice, every man who participated in the massacre, all faced justice. You're the last. Maddox barked a harsh laugh. Justice? Is that what you call your blood-soaked crusade? You're no better than I am, Blackwood, just another killer with a story he tells himself to justify the bodies. The difference, Blackwood replied evenly, taking another step forward, is that every man I've killed had the blood of innocence on his hands. You butchered families for gold, Ezekiel, children for profit. Something in Maddox's expression shifted then. Calculation, giving way to genuine hatred. Your family died quickly, which is more mercy than most received. I saved you for last because I wanted you to live with it. Wanted the famous Captain Blackwood to experience what real helplessness feels like. A murmur ran through our defenders at this confirmation of Blackwood's military background. Even I, who had heard portions of his story, felt the weight of this revelation. The decorated war hero reduced to an instrument of vengeance by unimaginable loss. And now you've experienced it as well, Blackwood continued, another step bringing him inexorably closer to his quarry. Watching your empire crumble, your men deserting or dying, everything you built turning to dust before your eyes. Maddox's response was predictable, yet still shocking in its sudden violence. He burst from cover, firing rapidly as he charged directly at Blackwood. The first shot went wide, the second appeared to graze Blackwood's side, tearing fabric but drawing no reaction. Before the third could find its mark, Blackwood's revolver appeared in his hand as if conjured from air itself. He fired once. The single shot echoed with strange finality across the battlefield. Maddox staggered, clutching his chest, his own weapon dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers. He remained upright through sheer force of will, his expression transforming from rage to something approaching respect as Blackwood approached him. With measured steps, "You could have killed me instantly," Maddox observed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Heart shot would have ended it clean." "Left lung," Blackwood corrected dispassionately. "You have minutes, not seconds. Time. Enough to contemplate what awaits you." Maddox sank to his knees, his breathing increasingly labored. "You think this ends anything? There will always be men like me, always territory to claim, wealth to seize, power to exercise." "Yes," Blackwood acknowledged, "there will always be predators, but there will also always be those who stand against them. That balance defines our existence." With visible effort, Maddox straightened, determined to face death with whatever dignity remained to him. Was it worth it? Sacrificing everything, your humanity, your future, just to hunt us down? What are you now but a hollow shell, Blackwood? A ghost, with no purpose beyond this moment? The question seemed to penetrate Blackwood's implacable exterior, touching something vulnerable beneath. For a heartbeat, uncertainty flickered across his weathered features. The existential dilemma of a man who had defined himself solely through a mission now reaching its conclusion. "I am what you made me," he answered finally. "What happens after is a reckoning for tomorrow." Maddox's laugh dissolved into a wet cough, blood staining his beard. "Then we both die tonight. You from the bullet Harker just put in your back." His warning came too late. A shot cracked from somewhere behind Blackwood, the impact driving him forward a half step. I turned to see Quinn, or Hargrove as Blackwood had named him, emerging from the shadows of an alley, rifle raised for a second shot. Before he could fire again, Captain McAllister's revolver barked twice. Quinn collapsed without a sound, his final betrayal incomplete, but the damage was done. Blackwood remained standing through what appeared to be sheer force of will, blood already darkening his coat where the bullet had struck just below his left. Shoulder blade, even mortally wounded, Maddox found satisfaction in this development, his dying features animated by grim triumph. "Symmetry," he gasped. "You'll follow me into darkness after all." "Perhaps," Blackwood conceded, showing no reaction to his wound beyond a slight stiffening of his posture. "But you go first, and you go alone." He raised his revolver once more, not in anger, but with the solemn deliberation of an executioner performing necessary duty. The second shot ended Ezekiel Maddox's life with clinical precision, the scorpion's reign concluding not with grand declarations, but with the mundane finality of mortality. For a suspended moment, silence reclaimed Cottonwood Springs. Then activity erupted from all quarters, marshals securing surrendering attackers, townspeople emerging from defensive positions, Dr. Langley moving among the wounded with newfound purpose. The battle had ended as decisively as it had begun, with Maddox's remaining forces either dead, captured, or fleeing into the darkness. Blackwood alone remained motionless amidst this sudden animation, standing over his vanquished enemy with an expression suggesting neither triumph nor satisfaction, but rather a hollow completion. The execution of a task that had defined him for so long, he scarcely remembered existence without its weight. When he finally turned away from Maddox's body, the extent of his injury became apparent. Blood soaked his left side from shoulder to hip, yet he moved with the same controlled precision that had characterized his every action since arriving in our town. He acknowledged McAllister with a brief nod before making his way toward the church, refusing assistance from those who approached him. I intercepted him at the church steps, alarmed by his pallor, visible even in the uncertain illumination of moon and scattered lanterns. "You need medical attention," I insisted, reaching toward him uncertainly. "Not yet," he replied, his voice betraying no pain, though it must have been considerable. "There's one matter remaining." Inside the church basement, Judge Haynes and Sheriff Bennett remained secured alongside Absalom Crane and other captured members of Maddox's organization. They looked up with apprehension as Blackwood descended into their makeshift prison, his blood-soaked appearance heightening the spectral quality that had earned him his reputation. "Maddox is dead," he announced without preamble. "His operation dismantled. At dawn, you'll be transported to the territorial capital to face formal charges for your crimes." "You have no authority," Judge Haynes blustered, though his quavering voice belied his attempted defiance. "This entire insurrection is illegal, and any evidence collected will be presented before a federal magistrate," Captain McAllister interrupted, following Blackwood down the stairs with official documents in hand, along with sworn statements from dozens of witnesses and documentary evidence of corruption stretching back years. "Your legal maneuvering has ended, Your Honor." Turning his attention to Crane, Blackwood approached the confessor with deliberate steps. The skeletal man shrank back involuntarily, his usual calculating demeanor replaced by naked fear. "Your information about the mining tunnels proved accurate," Blackwood acknowledged. "That accuracy has purchased your life, though not your freedom. You'll stand trial alongside your associates." "And if I continue to cooperate?" Crane asked, some measure of his composure returning. "Testify against the others? Provide details of operations beyond Cottonwood Springs?" Blackwood studied him with the detached interest one might accord an especially repellent insect. "Then perhaps you'll die in prison of old age, rather than at the end of a rope. A better end than you deserve, but justice sometimes requires pragmatic compromise." With that pronouncement, he turned and ascended the stairs, his movements growing visibly more labored with each step. I followed, concerned by the blood trail he left in his wake. "You need Langley," I insisted, once we reached the church's main floor. "That wound is beyond Langley's capabilities," Blackwood finished for me, his voice maintaining its steady calm despite his deteriorating condition. "Though I appreciate your concern, Mr. Sullivan," he moved toward the church doors, stepping out into the night air now tainted with gunpowder and the metallic scent of blood. The main street had transformed into an improvised field hospital, with the wounded from both sides receiving treatment according to severity rather than allegiance. Among them worked Sarah Patterson and Clara Winslow, their usual roles abandoned as they assisted Dr. Langley with surprising competence. Blackwood surveyed the scene with an expression I couldn't decipher, perhaps approval, perhaps something more complex. Then with characteristic unexpectedness, he turned toward the livery stables instead of the medical station. "Where are you going?" I demanded, frustration overcoming deference. "You need immediate attention." "There's something I must retrieve." "First," he replied without slowing, "something secured long before tonight's conflict began." Inside the dimly lit stable, he moved unerringly to a specific stall that had stood empty since our preparations began. Kneeling with visible difficulty, he removed several floorboards to reveal a small leather satchel hidden in the space beneath. The effort of this simple action left him trembling, yet he refused my offered assistance with a sharp gesture. From the satchel, he withdrew an oilskin-wrapped package and what appeared to be a journal bound in weathered leather. Both he handled with incongruous gentleness, as if they possessed value beyond any material consideration. "Insurance," he explained, noting my puzzled expression, "and legacy. The complete account of Willow Creek and its aftermath, including evidence implicating government officials who protected Maddox and his superiors. Names, dates, financial transactions, everything required to continue the work should I fail to complete it." "But you have completed it," I pointed out. "Maddox is dead. The conspirators captured. It's finished." Blackwood's smile contained more sorrow than satisfaction. "Justice for Willow Creek, yes, but Maddox was correct about one thing. There will always be others like him. Men who view law as an inconvenience and human lives as acceptable currency for their ambitions." With careful movements that belied his weakening condition, he pressed both items into my hands. "These belong to Captain McAllister now. He'll know what to do with them." The simple action carried unmistakable finality, a passing of responsibility, a recognition of impending transition. Before I could protest, Blackwood straightened with visible effort and made his way outside, where his Copper Morgan stood saddled and waiting. "You can't ride in your condition," I objected, following him into the cool night air. "Cottonwood Springs has been liberated. Stay, receive treatment, recover among people who owe you everything. That debt belongs to everyone who stood against Maddox tonight, not to me alone," he countered, checking his saddle straps with mechanical precision despite his increasingly evident weakness. "As for my condition," he paused, something almost like humor touching his features. "Death and I have kept company these 15 years, Mr. Sullivan. We have an understanding." By now, others had noticed his preparations for departure. Clara Winslow approached swiftly, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and dismay. "You can't leave, not like this," she insisted, echoing my own protests. "Dr. Langley may not be a military surgeon, but he can at least stabilize your wound until proper medical help arrives." Captain McAllister joined us, his weathered features betraying concern despite his professional demeanor. "She's right, Blackwood. You've lost too much blood for safe travel. At least wait until morning." "Dawn brings complications we'd rather avoid," Blackwood replied cryptically. "Questions from territorial authorities, investigations that might prove inconvenient for your detachment's unorthodox operation here." Understanding dawned in McAllister's eyes. Blackwood was protecting not just himself, but the marshals who had bent regulations to assist him. The living legend of Thomas Blackwood, Ghost Avenger of Willow Creek, needed to vanish into frontier mythology rather than face the mundane realities of official inquiries and paperwork. "At least tell us where you're headed," I asked, recognizing the futility of further objections. In case I don't survive?" Blackwood finished for me, mounting his horse with a fluidity that belied his injury. "North. There's a place in the high country where the dead can rest and the living can remember why life matters. With slow deliberation, he surveyed the gathering that had formed around him. McAllister and his marshals, Clara and Sarah, Jacob Miller and Dr. Langley, and dozens of ordinary townspeople whose courage had transformed them from victims to architects of their own liberation. "Cottonwood Springs has found its strength," he observed quietly. "Remember it when future challenges arise. The measure of a community isn't the absence of threats, but its response when they appear." Without further ceremony, he urged his mount forward, departing not at the gallop of dramatic escapes, but at a measured walk, befitting a man with no need for hasty exits. We watched in collective silence as his silhouette diminished against the star-filled sky, none voicing the thought that surely occupied every mind, that we were witnessing not just a departure, but a final journey, an epilogue to a story 15 years in creation. "Will he survive?" Clara asked finally, addressing her question to Captain McAllister as the most likely to possess insight into Blackwood's true condition. The marshal stroked his mustache thoughtfully before responding. "Thomas Blackwood died at Willow Creek by any reasonable standard. Everything since has been borrowed time, driven by a purpose now fulfilled." He tucked the journal and oilskin package I'd delivered into his coat with careful reverence. Whether his body continues for days or years seems almost irrelevant to the larger truth. As dawn approached, Cottonwood Springs began the process of reckoning with its transformation. The dead, both defenders and attackers, were laid out with equal dignity behind the church. The wounded received care according to need rather than allegiance. Maddox's surviving forces, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered to McAllister's. Marshals without further resistance. Judge Haynes, Sheriff Bennett, and their fellow conspirators were loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial capital, their formerly imperious demeanors reduced to sullen resignation. Even the fearsome confessor appeared diminished in defeat, his skeletal frame hunched beneath the weight of impending judgment. Standing outside my store as morning painted the eastern horizon in gold and crimson, I found myself alongside Jacob Miller, his blacksmith's strength evident even in repose as he contemplated the transformed settlement. "Town needs rebuilding," he observed practically. "New sheriff, legitimate judge, proper distribution of mining claims. Won't be easy establishing order after all this chaos." "No," I agreed. "But for the first time in years, it will be our order, not something imposed through corruption and fear." He nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drawn to the northern horizon where Blackwood had disappeared hours earlier. "Think he'll make it to wherever he was headed?" The question had no simple answer. Blackwood's wound had been severe, possibly mortal, yet his determination transcended ordinary human limitations. If anyone could survive through sheer force of will, it would be the ghost of Willow Creek. "I think," I replied carefully, "that Thomas Blackwood will find exactly what he seeks, whether that's healing or final rest." Jacob accepted this ambiguous assessment with a blacksmith's practicality. Either way, we owe him a debt that can't be repaid directly. Best we can do is build something worthy of his sacrifice. Spring came early to Cottonwood Springs that year, painting the surrounding hills in wildflower hues, while the last patches of winter snow still clung to shadowed ravines. 6 months had passed since the night of fire and reckoning that had transformed our settlement from a corrupted fiefdom to a community of purpose and promise. Where broken buildings once stood, new structures now reached skyward. The charred remains of the broken spur had given way to the Frontier Exchange, a gathering place where miners and ranchers conducted legitimate business. Sarah Patterson's school overflowed with children no longer kept home by fearful parents. Most telling of all was the easy laughter that now filled our streets, the sound of people liberated from tyranny's shadow. Jacob Miller served as our interim sheriff, his blacksmith's integrity a stark contrast to Bennett's corruption. Clara Winslow managed the land title office, ensuring property rights remained sacrosanct. Even Dr. Langley had found redemption, the events of that night inspiring him to set aside the bottle and reclaim his medical purpose. Of Thomas Blackwood, however, we'd heard nothing since his twilight departure. Many assumed his wounds had proven fatal. Others preferred more hopeful narratives. The legend had grown with each retelling, transforming our mysterious defender into something approaching mythology. The ghost avenger who appeared when justice faltered, then vanished once balance was restored. I was arranging books in my store's new reading room when Captain McAllister appeared unexpectedly in my doorway, trail dust still clinging to his cavalry coat. "Mr. Sullivan?" He nodded briskly. "Town looks prosperous, recovered well." "Captain," I acknowledged, setting aside my inventory. "We didn't expect to see you again. The trials concluded last week. Judge Haynes, Crane, and 3 others will hang at month's end. Bennett turned state's evidence, life imprisonment instead of the rope." His weathered face revealed satisfaction at justice delivered. "Those documents Blackwood entrusted to us have proven quite effective. 4 territorial officials removed, 2 senators implicated. The cancer ran deeper than even he suspected." I hesitated before asking the question foremost in my mind. "And Blackwood himself? Any word?" Something complex crossed McAllister's features. Not quite grief, not quite wonder. "That's why I'm here. 3 weeks ago, a package arrived at my office. No sender identified, but the contents." He withdrew a folded paper from his coat. "This was intended for Cottonwood Springs. I felt it should be delivered personally." The paper contained just 3 sentences in Blackwood's distinctive handwriting. "The debt is paid in full. The ghosts have found their rest. Remember what you built, not what you destroyed." "He survived," I breathed, recognizing the implications. McAllister's smile held cautious optimism. "Appears so, at least long enough to send this. Whether he still walks among the living." He shrugged expressively. "Some men belong to history rather than ordinary existence. Blackwood completed his purpose. Perhaps that's resolution enough." That evening, we gathered at the newly constructed memorial outside town, a simple stone marker commemorating those who had stood against tyranny. I shared Blackwood's message, watching as its impact registered on faces that had witnessed our settlements. Transformation from subjugation to self-determination. "To Thomas Blackwood," Jacob Miller proposed, raising his glass in the sunset light, "who showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to face it directly." "To all who stood when standing mattered," Clara Winslow added, her eyes bright with purpose rather than tears. As darkness settled over Cottonwood Springs, I found myself contemplating the northern horizon where Blackwood had disappeared that fateful night. Whether he survived his wounds or found a more permanent peace seemed almost immaterial against the larger truth, that justice, once awakened, creates its own momentum. That ordinary people, when unified in purpose, can accomplish extraordinary transformation, that sometimes the most enduring legacy of a ghost isn't vengeance, but the living community forged in the crucible of its passing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.